Have you ever imagined a creature, taller than any man, covered in coarse fur, with amber eyes full of sorrow, kneeling before the Virgin Mary, hands clasped in silent prayer? That's what the townspeople of Ennis, Montana witnessed in 1987. A wild being, known only in whispers as Bigfoot, didn't come to beg for its own salvation. It came to plead for a dying man, the very man who once spared its life in a snowstorm years before. This isn't just a legend. It's a true tale of quiet redemption, of a monster who wasn't monstrous, and of a widow who saw humanity in the eyes of something the world had forgotten. In a moment when most ran in fear, one soul stood still and listened. In the next 60 seconds, you'll hear the story of a prayer without words, a life saved by loyalty, and a community forever changed by a handful of dry grass and the touch of a giant's trembling hand. And now, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? How far can a story like this travel? Let's see how wide we can spread this moment of grace. From our small corner of the world to yours. Warmest regards to you, dear viewer. Late summer laid itself over the town of Ennis like a hush before prayer, the kind of quiet that made you feel small against the endlessness of the sky. The last of the sunlight bled gold across the Madison Valley, where hayfields stretched in soft waves and the pine trees held their breath just beyond the fence lines. It was the kind of evening where shadows grew long and warm wind tugged gently at old porch flags. A hush settled over everything, a stillness so thick you could hear the cattle chewing and the sigh of grass under their hooves. At the edge of town, just past the two-lane road that bled into gravel, stood the statue of the Virgin Mary. Weathered by decades of sun and snow, she stood with her arms outstretched over a patch of dry clover, a hand-carved rosary looped through her fingers. Folks called her the Lady of the Meadow. Some came to pray, others came to forget. But mostly she was just there, constant like the land. That night, just as the last amber streaks faded behind the ridgeline, something moved in the tall grass beneath her. At first, it was a rustle, too soft to notice unless you were looking. Then came the thud, heavy, intentional, a presence. Harlan Duval, the gas station attendant, was the first to see it. He had been smoking a cigarette outside the pump house when he squinted up across the field and froze. "Jesus!" he muttered, breath hitching in his throat. The cigarette dropped from his fingers. It rose out of the grass like something ancient, something carved from the forest itself. Towering, broad-shouldered, covered in thick, dark brown fur laced with pale silver streaks. Its arms were long. Its chest heaved slow and heavy. But it was the face that stole the air from Harlan's lungs. Not beast, not animal. A human-like wild man face. Amber eyes locked onto the statue, reflecting the dying sun like glass soaked in honey. The creature's features were weathered, expressive, skin faintly visible beneath the sparse fur across its cheeks and brow. A broad, flat nose, a jaw strong and square. No fangs, no snarl, just sorrow, ancient and undressed. Without a sound, the creature stepped forward through the grass and slowly sank to its knees before the statue. It didn't growl, didn't howl, it just knelt. Two massive hands, fingers long and human-like, came together in front of its chest. Its head bowed, its chest rose and fell once, deeply, like it was swallowing something it couldn't say out loud. From the diner window, someone screamed. Across town, porch lights blinked on. Harlan stumbled back against the pump. "He's back! God help us, the thing's back!" Footsteps scrambled. Voices rose. People spilled out into the street like floodwater. Some curious, some terrified, most with rifles. But not all. Mabel Quinn stood barefoot on her porch, a dish towel still in her hand. 68. White hair pulled into a neat twist, eyes the color of old denim. The wind picked at her nightgown as she stepped down the 3 wooden stairs and looked toward the field. Her heart didn't beat faster. It slowed, like it recognized something it hadn't seen in years. She walked past the porch gate, past the mailbox, across the dirt road and into the dry clover, never looking away from the figure that knelt before the Virgin. Behind her, someone hissed, "Mabel, get back! Are you crazy?" But she didn't hear them. The creature turned its head just slightly, sensing her approach. It didn't run. It didn't stand. It only looked. Their eyes met, amber to blue. In that silence, Mabel saw what no one else did. This wasn't something lost from time or myth. This was someone who was hurting. Its lips parted, breath slow. The brows tensed in a way she'd only ever seen in people about to lose someone they loved. It wasn't begging for itself. It was praying. Mabel stepped forward and stopped beside the statue. The creature looked up at the stone figure again, then slowly turned its head and glanced toward the tree line. The motion was almost shy, an invitation. It looked back once more. Then it rose. Every muscle in its towering frame seemed to hesitate, as if the act of standing pained it. It didn't roar. It didn't charge. It just walked away. As it reached the edge of the woods, it turned its head over its shoulder. One last time, the look it gave was not one of threat, not even of warning. It was hope, fragile and trembling. Mabel pressed her hand to her chest. She didn't understand how, but she knew. The prayer wasn't for itself. Someone was dying, and that creature had come here for help. Behind her, the voices of the townspeople were rising, some still panicked, some now silent, unsure. Someone fired a warning shot into the air, and birds scattered into the sky. But the creature was already gone, disappeared like smoke into the forest beyond the hayfields. Mabel didn't turn back toward the crowd. She just stood there, eyes on the woods, until the last of the gold light faded behind the ridges and the night wrapped around Ennis like a secret it wasn't ready to share. Later, at the diner, folks would talk. They'd draw lines in the dust between what they saw and what they believed. They'd swear it was a bear, a man in a costume, an omen. But Mabel wouldn't argue. She knew what she'd seen. Not just the face, not just the gesture, but the sorrow, the kind that didn't come from fear of dying, the kind that came from fearing someone else might. That night, sleep came to Ennis like a weight, except for Mabel. She sat at her window, eyes fixed on the tree line in the distance. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood quiet and moonlit, the grass at her feet pressed down in the shape of two knees. Somewhere out there in the folds of the Madison Range, something had bent before a symbol of mercy, not to ask for it, but to offer it, and in the silence that followed, something had shifted, like a door had opened, like a path had been laid, not just between species or stories or woods and fields, but between faith and action, between memory and debt, between the prayers we speak and the ones we carry in silence, the kind that kneel in plain sight, hoping someone will see, someone will follow. And for the first time in many years, Mabel Quinn felt that old, quiet stirring in her chest. Not fear, faith, and something else. Like the first leaf twitching before the wind moves. Like the first sound in a story you didn't know you needed. A story that was just beginning. The nights in the Madison Valley didn't fall so much as they folded. Slow and dense like a blanket pulled over your shoulders by something older than wind. After what the people of Ennis had seen by the statue, few dared speak of it directly. But silence doesn't mean stillness. It just means waiting. And that night, even the waiting had a heartbeat. The sounds came just past midnight. Low. Not the cry of an animal. Not the thunder of weather. Something in between. A deep, guttural rumble that seemed to roll off the ridgelines and settle into the bones of the houses. Mabel Quinn sat up in bed without knowing why. Her hand went to the window before her mind did. The glass was cold, the field outside blanketed in shadow, and yet something pulsed in the dark. A presence that hadn't left, a plea that hadn't been answered. She didn't sleep after that. By morning, the sky had turned the pale gray of an old bed sheet hung to dry. Dew clung thick on the grass, and mist braided through the cottonwoods like smoke from a dying fire. Somewhere near the back fence of the Beckett house, a child's voice called out. Not afraid, just puzzled. "Daddy, come look at this." Nora Beckett stood at the edge of the backyard, her knees muddy, one sock sliding down into her boot. 8 years old, sharp-eyed like her mother used to be, with a stubbornness that had only deepened since the day the world took her. She pointed to the ground, where a trail of wide, deep impressions led from the tree line and curved through the wet grass like a message written in silence. Troy Beckett stood behind her, steaming coffee in hand, badge pinned crooked to a flannel shirt. His gaze followed the prints for a long time before he crouched down to touch one. He looked more tired than curious. "Probably a bear, honey," he said, ruffling her hair. She didn't believe that. He didn't either. But it was easier than saying what he was really thinking. Beside the footprints was a long, disturbed groove in the grass, like something heavy had been dragged. Nora pressed her small hand into one of the prints. Her fingers barely touched the edges. "That ain't no bear," she whispered. By mid-morning, word had drifted across town like the scent of bacon on a still day. Mabel was already tying the sleeves of her old canvas coat when Nora came pounding on her front door, eyes bright and fierce. "They're real," the girl blurted out. "The footprints. I saw them with Daddy. He said it was a bear, but he's lying." Mabel didn't ask any questions. She just grabbed her walking stick, tucked a canteen into her bag, and stepped onto the porch. 2 men were already waiting at the edge of her property. Walt Harlan and Clay Fitch, both in their 60s, both born from this land and worn by it. Walt had been driving fence since '52, and Clay could track a coyote through gravel. Neither of them talked much, but their eyes met Mabel's, and that was enough. They walked with purpose, past the frostbitten barns and through the split-rail gates, out into the wide-open nowhere that most folks only looked at from behind their windows. The mist had begun to lift, and the trail was clear, prints like bowls pressed into the earth, following the ridge east toward the forest. They weren't chasing, they were answering. Nora stayed close to Mabel's side, her small steps quick and sure. She kept looking up toward the horizon like she expected something to come walking back the other way. Mabel didn't say anything, but she understood. That kind of hoping. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from something you've seen and don't want to forget. By the time they reached the rise above Blacktail Creek, the air had shifted. Birds were quiet. Pine needles twitched without wind. And then, movement. Far ahead, just where the trees began to deepen into shadow, a figure appeared. Massive. Walking uphill slow, like each step carried weight not just in body, but in spirit. The creature turned its head once, just slightly. Enough. It had come back. Not hiding, not running, just waiting. The 4 of them froze, not from fear, but something stranger. Recognition. The kind that turns in your chest before your mind catches up. It looked at them, not with the eyes of a beast cornered, but like someone hoping you'd followed. Then it turned and began walking again, slower this time, checking back every few paces. Walt cleared his throat. "I think it wants us to follow." Mabel nodded. The trail grew narrow, threading between ponderosa trunks and scattered stones. The scent of moss grew thicker, damp earth curling up through the soles of their boots. Somewhere overhead, a raven called once and then fell silent. The dragging mark in the grass became more pronounced, as if whatever had been pulled was heavy, barely moving. And then they saw him. At the foot of a sloped hollow, half hidden in the gold-dry ferns, a man lay face down. His body was curled awkwardly, one boot missing, clothes stained with dirt and blood. Barrett Lowe. Mabel felt her knees go weak. She hadn't seen him in years. Not since the spring he'd come by her porch with a bottle of choke cherry wine and a laugh that still sounded like thunder in her memory. Barrett had been the last of the old rangers still walking the woods like they were sacred. He disappeared 3 days ago, and folks had already started saying he'd gone off to die. The Bigfoot stopped at the edge of the hollow. Its shoulders heaved with quiet effort, hands trembling slightly at its sides. It looked at Mabel, not with pride or possession, but with a kind of desperation that cut straight through everything false in the world. Like it had carried this man as far as it could, and needed help now. Mabel was already scrambling down the slope before anyone could stop her. She knelt beside Barrett, pressed her fingers to his neck. His pulse fluttered like a thread caught on a nail. Barely there. Lips dry and bluish. Skin cold. "He's alive," she whispered. Walt and Clay were beside her in seconds. Clay peeled off his coat and rolled it up beneath Barrett's head. Walt pulled a flashlight from his belt, checking his pupils. Everything about Barrett was failing, but they hadn't arrived too late. Mabel looked up, eyes meeting the creature's once more. There was no joy there, just relief and exhaustion. The kind that sinks into bone. The creature took one slow step forward and reached out a massive hand toward Barrett's chest. It didn't touch him. Hovered there instead, fingers shaking slightly, as if feeling for something no one else could. Then it placed its hand gently against the ranger's ribs and held it there. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Barrett let out a rasping breath, shallow but audible. Mabel's hand flew to her mouth. Nora let out a gasp behind her. The Bigfoot drew its hand back and stepped away, as if its part was finished. Mabel rose, walked toward it slowly. Her voice trembled. "You prayed for him, didn't you?" The creature didn't answer, but it didn't need to. It lowered its head just enough for the sunlight to catch the edge of its cheek, where something shimmered. Tears, not of joy, of release. She took another step, close enough now to feel the size of it, the heat it gave off. It didn't flinch, didn't run. It trusted. Barrett coughed, a weak but living sound. Clay barked into the old radio, voice cracking, calling for the medic unit on standby. But Mabel stayed where she was, eyes locked on the creature before her. Because she understood now, the kneeling wasn't a plea for safety. It was a request. Help him, please. This wasn't a monster. This was someone who remembered a kindness from long ago. Someone who'd come down from the trees, not for food, not for vengeance, but for mercy. And in that moment, with the birds still silent and the forest holding its breath, the world felt like it was tilting back towards something it had forgotten how to be. When the others rushed to lift Barrett, the Bigfoot stepped back again, fading into the trees without sound. Not running, just returning. Its part had been done, but the story wasn't finished. Not yet. The slope behind them was quiet now, the kind of quiet that came only after something had passed through. A storm, a prayer, a creature no one had words for. Barrett's body lay still, curled near the roots like a fallen tree. His chest barely moved. His lips were blue at the edges, and his breath rattled like winter wind through old screen doors. Mabel knelt beside him, her knees deep in the damp earth, one hand gripping the canteen, the other pressed against the old ranger's shoulder. His skin was cold, not yet gone, but slipping. There was no signal out here, no cell phones, no radio towers humming in the distance. Just pine and sky, and the failing pulse of a man who had walked these woods like they were sacred scripture. Troy had already turned and run, boots pounding against the loose gravel path as he vanished into the tree line, heading toward the old truck parked near the ranger gate. He'd have to drive back into town, call in from the fire station's landline. Nothing out here but silence and need. The Bigfoot had not left. It knelt again, across from her now, as if returning to the posture it had taken beneath the Virgin statue. Its massive form folded into the space like something shaped from the earth itself. Fur damp, chest rising slow, eyes focused on Barrett's face. It didn't speak. It didn't make a sound. But then it reached out. That great hand moved gently, almost reverently, and came to rest on Barrett's chest. Not to press, not to push life into him, just to be there, just to offer warmth, the way one animal might huddle beside another through a storm. The fingers flexed slightly. Mabel could see the veins under the fur, The way the skin around the knuckles shifted like her late husband's had when he bent down to stroke the dog's head in the dark. It stayed like that. She didn't interrupt. Clay stood off to the side, chewing the edge of his lip, eyes darting between them like he was watching something impossible and holy unfold. Nora clutched her knees to her chest a few yards away, silent for once, the weight of what she was seeing pressing down on the part of her still too young to name it. A crow called from somewhere high up. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of distant smoke from someone's morning stove. Mabel uncapped the canteen and held it toward the Bigfoot. Its eyes flicked to her hand. She watched it hesitate, not out of fear, but out of some quiet understanding of limits. It leaned back, just slightly, and nodded. So she leaned forward instead, tilting the cool water to Barrett's lips. A trickle ran down his chin. He didn't stir, but something in his chest caught. A stutter of breath that sounded less like dying. When the creature saw it, it blinked slow, then lowered its head in a gesture that Mabel felt in her throat. It was gratitude, not relief, not triumph, just pure, open gratitude. The kind that doesn't belong to speech. They waited like that for what felt like a small eternity. The four of them crouched in a circle the forest itself seemed to guard. When the sound of tires crunching gravel rose from behind the ridge, everyone turned. The ambulance was coming. The creature stood before the others did. Its movement was sudden, towering. It moved between the path and Barrett's body in a blink, as if rising out of instinct more than thought. A low growl vibrated through its chest. Not rage. Warning. Its arms widened, stance rooted. The ambulance skidded to a halt near the clearing. Two paramedics jumped out, one holding a portable defibrillator, the other a bright red pack. But both froze mid-step. One of them reached for his belt. "Don't," Mabel said, stepping quickly forward. She raised both hands. "He's protecting him." The younger EMT looked at her like she'd lost her mind. But the older one, Gary maybe, he paused, his gaze fixed on the creature's face. Something there must have made sense to him. The way the amber eyes didn't blink. The way its fingers twitched near its side like it was ready to fight, but didn't want to. Mabel kept her voice low. "They're here to help. He's not here to hurt anybody." The creature didn't move at first. Then slowly, it let its arms drop, shoulders sagging. It stepped back, not far, just enough. The paramedics rushed in, kneeling beside Barrett, calling codes to each other, checking vitals. The red light from the ambulance pulsed through the trees, washing the ferns in color. Barrett didn't respond to their voices, but the line on the monitor still danced. Barely. The creature watched all of it. When the EMTs lifted Barrett onto the gurney, it tensed again, one foot shifting forward. The monitor beeped louder. An oxygen mask covered Barrett's face now, and wires trailed from his chest like roots ripped from soil. The creature moved as if to follow, but Mabel stepped in between them gently. "He needs them now," she whispered. For a moment, it just stood there. She could see the muscles in its jaw working, could see the light hitting the curve of its cheek and catching something wet. It was afraid. Not of the men, not of the van, of losing him. Its hand rose slightly, then dropped again. Then it stepped back. One long step, then another. Mabel turned, waved toward the crew. "Go." The gurney rolled fast over the uneven earth. The back door slammed. The engine growled. Red lights faded into the trees. She turned back. The creature stood alone in the clearing now. The others had moved off to the truck, but it hadn't left. Not yet. Mabel stepped closer again. Her voice was just above breath. "He's in good hands, but I think he was in yours first." The creature's eyes flicked up, then lowered again. She felt the weight of that moment settle on her chest like a quilt of wet wool. He wasn't just a mystery anymore, not a shadow in the woods. He was a witness, a guardian, and maybe, just maybe, someone who still remembered the kindness of a man who had once bent in the snow to free a trapped limb from steel teeth. Because that's the thing no one tells you about mercy. It echoes, sometimes for years, sometimes across species. Sometimes it walks out of the woods with eyes full of grief and kneels before a statue because it has no words for what it feels. Later in town, there would be confusion, questions, exaggerations. But right now, in this corner of the world too far for cell towers and too quiet for sirens, something had held on just long enough to hand a man back to his kind. And even though the forest took him back, Mabel knew that wasn't the end. Not of the creature, not of Barrett, not of the prayer. Rain had a way of falling different in the Madison Valley. Soft at first, like the land was being reminded of something, then steady, then relentless. That afternoon, it came down in sheets, sweeping sideways through the cottonwoods and smearing the outlines of barns, fence posts, and telephone wires. The storm rode low and thick across the sky, dragging the light down with it until everything felt dim, even before dusk. On the dirt road winding through the foothills, tire tracks filled with water in seconds. Somewhere farther up the trail, red lights flared and flickered through the fog. The ambulance was moving slow, fighting both mud and grade as it curved toward town. Inside the cabin, the heater wheezed but didn't keep up. Barrett lay strapped on the gurney, pale and still, his breath barely visible in the cold air that snuck through the old frame. One paramedic watched the monitors. The other stared at the back door like he expected it to burst open again. Outside, a shadow ran with them, not beside the van, not visible at first, but near. Always near. The creature moved through the rain and slope like it had lived in it forever, never losing pace. Sometimes it fell back, then surged ahead, its massive form darting behind trees, weaving between brush like something out of an old ghost story. But it was real. So real, it left its own trail in the muck. If anyone had looked close, they would have seen the prints, huge and unmistakable, just inches from the ambulance tires. It wasn't following out of curiosity. It was guarding. By the time they reached the edge of Ennis, the sun had disappeared completely. The storm hung low across the rooftops like a wet tarp, and power lines trembled in the wind. The old town clinic, a narrow 2-story clapboard building that used to be a boarding house, stood just off Main Street. Its porch light flickered weakly. The windows glowed with lanterns. The power had gone out an hour before. They were running on diesel now, what little was left in the generator tank. As the ambulance pulled to a stop, its rear tires skidded slightly in the gravel. The driver flung open the back doors. Mabel was already waiting under the eaves, coat soaked, hair clinging to her cheeks. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from the weight of what was arriving. They wheeled Barrett inside fast. The hallway smelled like rubbing alcohol, rainwater, and something older. Wood, too long unvarnished. Dr. Ellen, barely 30, met them in the main room, sleeves rolled high, stethoscope already swinging around her neck. She barked orders without hesitation. They lifted Barrett onto the exam table, hooked him up to oxygen again, and restarted the heart monitor. The generator sputtered. A light went out in the corner. Someone cursed. And then the machine went dead. Everything went dark except the kerosene lantern Mabel held steady above the table, its soft glow licking the edges of the room in gold and shadow. No one spoke for a breath. Then Ellen turned, shouted for hand-cranked suction, for the oxygen backup tank, for anything that still worked without electricity. Out on the porch, something shifted. No one noticed at first. The rain had thickened, and the wind howled around the corners of the house like wolves looking for a way in. But Mabel turned toward the sound, barely audible beneath the rest. A scraping, a low thud. She walked to the door, opened it slowly, and there he was, standing beneath the awning, fur-drenched and dripping. His chest rose like a bellows, each breath steaming in the cold. His eyes met hers, not wild, not afraid, just aware. Present. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Behind him, she saw the bundles, Branches, dry bark, moss, even some long strips of old tarp he must have pulled from the firewood stack beside the church. He dropped them gently against the wall, stepped back, and waited. Mabel blinked, then turned, yelling for Walt. Together they hauled the kindling inside, piled it near the wood stove in the side hallway. Walt worked the flint, got a spark. The fire caught slow but steady, smoke curling up into the metal chimney pipe, warmth spreading through the baseboards like a slow sigh. No one asked where the wood had come from. No one questioned how it got there. The creature stayed just outside the porch light, just far enough for privacy, close enough to see everything. When the fire took and the light stayed out, he sat down in the shadow by the wall, legs folded, arms resting on his knees like some kind of forgotten sentinel. Hours passed. Barrett's breathing steadied just slightly, the numbers on the monitor, now running off a makeshift battery, ticking forward instead of back. Sometime after midnight, the rain stopped. The town was silent again, save for the faint hum of the generator and the occasional creak of floorboards under tired boots. The porch was slick with mist, and the wind carried the scent of pine and wet stone. Mabel stepped outside with a blanket over her arm. The Bigfoot didn't move as she approached. His fur was drying now, streaked with dirt and smoke, clumped around his shoulders. She paused beside him, then gently laid the blanket across his back. He didn't flinch, didn't turn, but when she stepped back, she found the blanket folded neatly on the steps, untouched. He wasn't here for comfort. He was here to keep watch. Behind the clinic walls, machines beeped. A man hovered between life and something thinner. But outside, on a porch slick with rain and silence, another kind of heart kept beating. One made not of chambers and valves, but of memory, of promise, of something owed and something returned. At dawn, the fire still crackled. The lanterns were low. Barrett stirred once, murmured something no one caught. Dr. Ellen wrote down the numbers, rubbed her eyes, and stood. Mabel poured coffee for the paramedics. Nora lay curled under a wool coat in the corner. And outside, the Bigfoot still sat, still watching, not for danger, but for a sign, for a breath, for forgiveness. And as the first light broke through the clouds, silver and soft across the rooftops, it caught the edge of the creature's face, just enough to show the wet shimmer beneath its eye. And still, he didn't move. He would wait, as long as it took. Because sometimes the only way to repay mercy is to stay. Snow came early that year. Not the kind that piled up fast, but the slow kind, like a warning. It fell in the hush between thoughts, settled in the corners of windows, drifted into porch rails and gutter seams. The first flakes had started just past dusk, thin as lint and barely visible, but by midnight they danced like ashes in the yellow glow of the clinic lanterns. Inside, the air was warm but fragile. The wood stove pulsed low in the hallway, casting soft light that flickered against the walls like a heartbeat too tired to keep time. Barrett lay beneath 2 wool blankets on the cot, face pale and still, mouth parted slightly around the oxygen tube. The skin around his eyes looked looser than before. Lived in. Like time had stepped on him a little too hard and not fully stepped back. Machines hummed quiet. The backup battery held, but no one trusted it. Mabel sat beside him in a wooden chair that had once belonged to her late husband. She hadn't slept more than 10 minutes at a time in 2 days. Her knuckles were cracked from the dry heat, her boots still wet from the last walk outside. She held a washcloth to Barrett's forehead and wiped gently, like tending a child, though neither of them were that anymore. Just outside the door, the Bigfoot lay curled under the eaves. No blanket, no food, no sound. The snow crusted his shoulders, melted into the thick fur along his back, clung to the curve of his brow like frost on a statue. He hadn't moved much since they brought Barrett in. Sometimes he shifted his weight, sometimes lifted his head toward the window when a sound came from within. But mostly he lay there still, like a dog beside a dying master, too proud to beg and too faithful to leave. Around 3 a.m, Mabel stepped out with a quilt draped over her arm. The air bit harder than before. Her breath fogged in the light as she crossed the porch and knelt beside him. He was watching the door, not her. She reached out slowly and laid the quilt across his shoulders. "I know you don't want it," she said softly, "but I'm giving it to you anyway." He didn't flinch. When she stood and turned to go back inside, the quilt was already folded again, resting on the steps like a quiet answer. Inside the clinic, something beeped. One long note, then silence. Mabel rushed in, boots dripping, heart stuttering. The monitor flickered, blinked, went black. Dr. Ellen shouted for the crash cart. The nurse began pumping Barrett's chest with both hands, counting under her breath. There was no electricity. The generator had gone quiet in the storm. The firewood was almost gone. The storm had knocked out every line for 10 miles, and yet somehow his body twitched. Once, a breath, weak but real, and then stillness again. Mabel grabbed his hand, pressed her forehead to it. "Stay," she whispered. "Just a little longer." Out on the porch, the Bigfoot sat upright. His hand tightened around his knee, jaw working with a strange rhythm. Like pain, like memory. He stood, moved closer to the door, but didn't enter. The light behind the curtain flickered as Barrett's chest rose again. This time slower, steadier. No one spoke for several minutes. When the crisis passed, Mabel walked back into the hallway and leaned against the wall, sliding slowly down until she sat beside the wood stove. She rubbed her face with both hands. She didn't know what held that man together anymore. Will, instinct, grace. But she knew he wasn't alone. Not really. Not with that figure outside, waiting for something only it understood. Nora came padding out from the back room where she'd been resting. Her hair was messy, and one sleeve of her sweater was tucked into the other. She sat beside Mabel on the floor without saying a word. Together they watched the glow of the stove cast orange shapes across the hallway. Time passed. The kind of time that doesn't tick. It drips, like rain in a cave, like hope in a tired heart. When Mabel stood again, she went to the supply cabinet for a clean towel. The old floorboards creaked under her steps. She moved toward the door, paused. Something had shifted in the air. She turned to the hallway. The Bigfoot was no longer on the porch. He was standing in the doorway. His frame filled the entrance like a shadow stepped out of the earth. But he didn't enter. He only leaned forward slightly, peering down the hall like he was listening to something most people couldn't hear. Mabel stepped forward slowly, palms raised. "It's okay," she said. "He's still here." The Bigfoot's eyes flicked to her, then past her, then back again. He turned slowly and stepped away, returning to the porch where the snow had gathered around his place on the floorboards. He crouched again, watching. The moment passed like a wave that never broke. Later, while cleaning the back hallway, Mabel caught sight of something she hadn't noticed before. A scar, long, jagged, running down the inside of the creature's left wrist, curling toward the palm. Not fresh, years old, the kind that healed but never faded. She felt her breath catch. She remembered. Barrett, the winter of '78. The story he'd told a few times when he'd had a drink, about finding something caught in a steel jaw trap. Not a bear, not a coyote. Something tall, something that bled like a man. He hadn't spoken of it again after that spring. Had laughed it off, called it a trick of the cold. But she knew now. That scar was real. Barrett had saved a life, and now that life was saving him, she didn't tell anyone that night. Some things aren't meant to be explained. Some things are meant to be witnessed. Barrett didn't wake. Not fully, but his breathing held steady. His fingers twitched once under the blanket, and that was enough. Enough to keep the fire going. Enough to keep the figure outside where he was, watching, waiting, carrying something heavier than the storm. Not duty, not debt, just something deeper. And by dawn, the snow had stopped again, but the silence that remained had changed, like something had been mended without words. And yet the story wasn't finished, not even close. The morning broke with an edge in the wind. The kind that slipped down your collar and whispered that winter wasn't asking anymore. It was here. In Ennis, Montana, the sky hung low and pewter-colored, pressing over the rooftops like a hand trying to hush the town. Snow from the night before still clung to the branches, and the hush it left behind made even the smallest sounds feel loud. Somewhere down the road, a screen door slammed, and that alone was enough to turn heads. Word had gotten out. It started as whispers. At the post office, the diner, outside the co-op where men smoked in silence and women paused with grocery sacks half lifted. But whispers have a way of turning sharp when the thing they describe can't be controlled. Some folks had seen the footprints near the meadow. Some had seen the figure in the tree line, and a few had watched the ambulance arrive at the clinic with the creature following just behind, half hidden in the storm like something from a fever dream. Now they were showing up. Trucks lined up crooked against the curb, some with rifles racked in the rear windows, others with nothing but a pair of sharp eyes and sharper opinions. A man in a wool coat stood near the clinic's porch, peering through binoculars like he was watching a bear den. Another one leaned against the lamppost, hand resting too comfortably on the butt of a shotgun. Inside the clinic, Mabel stood at the window, lips pressed thin. The blinds had been drawn, but folks outside weren't stupid. They knew something was in there, something not supposed to be, something that made their hearts crawl and their knuckles itch. Troy Beckett pushed open the front door and stepped inside with the kind of presence that comes from holding something heavy in your chest. He wasn't wearing his badge. He hadn't since the night Barrett was found. But the way he filled the doorway said enough. "They're getting riled up," he said, voice low. "Some of them have been drinking." Mabel didn't answer. She just glanced at the back hallway where the wood stove still burned and the giant still waited. "He hasn't moved since sunrise," she said. "I know." Troy rubbed his jaw, let out a slow breath. "It's not him I'm worried about." In the next room, Barrett stirred. Not quite awake, but not lost either. His hands twitched under the blanket, and his mouth moved like it was chasing the shape of a name. Ellen checked his vitals without speaking, but her eyes kept flicking toward the door. Everyone was waiting for something, anything, that would tip the balance. Then it happened. A voice from outside, loud and mean. "What the hell are we doing waiting? That thing ain't gonna stick around forever." Another joined in. "You saw what it did to that deer carcass out by Nelson's fence last fall." "That wasn't it," someone else muttered. "How the hell do you know?" The voices rose, merging into one long rumble of fear and memory and bad faith. Mabel stepped back from the window, heart beating like a tin drum. "Troy," she said quietly, "I'm on it." He pushed the door open again and stepped outside, hands raised. His voice cut through the air like the last clear bell in a storm. "Enough." They turned to him. Rough men, cold faces, hands too close to their weapons. "You all know me," Troy said. "You know my father. You know this town. That thing inside didn't hurt anyone, didn't touch a soul. It's not prowling, it's not hunting. It saved Barrett Lowe's life." "That thing's dangerous, Sheriff," one of the men barked, forgetting the badge wasn't on his chest anymore. Troy didn't blink. "Yeah, so are we." The silence that followed wasn't peace, just pause. From behind the clinic door, Nora's voice rang out suddenly. "Daddy!" She was running, fast, too fast. Her boots skidded on the porch boards. She slipped. Her foot caught the edge of the top stair. She pitched forward hard. In the same breath, the clinic door burst open behind her, and the creature moved. It was faster than anyone thought something that big could be. One step, two, and its arms were around her before she hit the boards. She landed in its arms, cradled like a baby, her face buried against the thick fur of its shoulder. No sound, no growl, no rush, just stillness. A breath. Everyone froze. Even the men with their guns half raised, their mouths open but no words left, because what they saw wasn't what they expected. That massive creature, 9 feet tall and built like a myth, was holding an 8-year-old girl like she was made of glass. His hand cupped her back, his chin dipped toward her crown, and in his eyes, clear in the fading afternoon light, was something so unmistakably human, it made the wind stop cold. Fear, not of them, of losing her. Troy stepped forward slowly, one hand out. "Hey," he said gently. "You can let her go now." The Bigfoot looked up, eyes meeting his. Then it bent low and set Nora down as carefully as one lays down hope. She stood straight, wiped her eyes, and turned to face the men gathered in the snow. "He's not a monster," she said. "He's kind." Then she walked back inside, the door closing behind her like the end of a hymn. No one spoke. A man lowered his rifle. Another stepped back. Mabel stepped onto the porch, her voice steady as stone. "You all came here looking for something to fear, but maybe you found something to learn from instead." Troy turned without another word, following his daughter back inside. The creature stood alone for a moment longer, eyes scanning the line of faces, none of which looked the same anymore. Then he turned and stepped backward into the shadow beside the clinic wall, not hiding, just waiting. The people left, not all at once, not with cheers or cries of understanding, just slowly, quietly, like something had shifted and they weren't sure what to do with it. And inside, Barrett's fingers closed slightly around the edge of his blanket, as if something in him too had decided to stay, and the season outside the window didn't feel quite as cold. Morning came quiet, as if it had been watching everything unfold and didn't want to disturb what was still healing. A pale winter sun nudged at the clinic windows, its light too soft to warm but bright enough to reveal dust in the air and frost tracing lace patterns along the sill. Inside, the wood stove had burned down to glowing coals. The machines hummed a little steadier now. Barrett was still asleep, but the worry in the room had started to ease, less like a storm cloud, and more like the damp earth left behind. The Bigfoot hadn't left. He hadn't even changed his place. Through all the shifts of night into day, he stayed seated beneath the porch awning, knees drawn up, arms resting across them like the world hadn't taught him another way to wait. His fur was half dry now, and the snow that had built up on his shoulders had melted and refrozen into tiny beads of ice, clinging to the longer strands near his elbows. His face, still, the same weathered, human-like wild man face the town had seen when it broke its own fear. His eyes didn't close. They stayed trained on the door, and from time to time, they wandered up to the wooden crossbeam of the porch roof, like he was keeping count of something only he understood. Barrett stirred around mid-morning. A soft groan left his throat, his brow wrinkled like he was waking from a long, heavy dream he hadn't agreed to. Ellen was at his side within seconds, checking the pulse ox, adjusting the tubes. He blinked slowly, trying to take in the ceiling. Then he whispered something rough. "Outside. Where is he?" Mabel moved closer, took his hand. "He's here, still right here." Barrett's head turned slightly toward the sound of her voice. She saw the memory surface behind his tired gaze, half disbelief, half something deeper. Something like peace. He didn't leave. No. His eyes closed again. A breath moved through his chest like a river breaking ice. Later that day, when the wind had shifted west and the light turned to that soft gold Ennis was known for in winter, the Bigfoot stood up, slowly, quietly. His knees cracked faintly as he straightened. Mabel heard it from inside and looked out the window just in time to see him step off the porch and walk to the edge of the lot, where the snow met the frozen gravel. Then he did something no one expected. He reached into the fold of his thick fur and pulled out a dried sprig of wild grass, brown and brittle, its seeds still clinging to the stem like they didn't know the season had changed. He held it between his fingers, studied it a moment, then turned toward the small statue of the Virgin Mary that stood across the narrow clinic yard. The one some folks thought was old superstition and others still whispered prayers to after Sunday service. He walked to her. No rush, just steady steps, and when he reached her, he knelt again. The way he had in the field that first evening before anyone dared believe what they saw. The same position, the same reverence. But this time, There was no desperation, no pleading, just offering. He placed the dried sprig at her feet, bowed his head. From the second-story window, Barrett watched, propped up on a stack of pillows. His voice was still raw, but when he whispered, it was clear enough. He came back. Mabel turned from the window, sat beside him, and nodded once. He never left. Barrett's hand, rough and calloused, reached toward the edge of the blanket and rested there. He didn't ask for anything else, didn't try to understand it. Some things don't ask for understanding, they just ask to be witnessed. When the Bigfoot rose, he didn't look at the building. He turned his head toward the mountains and stood there a while, shoulders relaxed, breath steady. Then, as if sensing it across the wall, Barrett's voice floated again. He didn't forget. And in that moment, Mabel remembered something else. The way forgiveness never arrives loudly. The way mercy, when it's real, doesn't need words or announcements. It just waits for the right time to return something once given. Later that afternoon, Troy stepped into the room, hat in hand, face drawn with something more than just fatigue. He stood by Barrett's bed and didn't speak right away. Then he cleared his throat. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. Barrett looked up at him, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "That trap," Troy continued, voice tight. "The one from 78, the steel jaw, that wasn't yours." Barrett didn't speak. "It was mine," Troy said. "Back when I was running with the old forest patrol, we were supposed to clear all the illegal gear out of North Fork, and I left one behind. Thought it'd be fine. But that winter, something got caught in it." Barrett blinked slow. "I knew you found something," Troy went on. "Knew you freed it. I didn't ask questions because I was scared of the answers, but it should have been me. I should have been the one hurt, or the one owed." Barrett's lips twitched, the closest thing he could manage to a smile. "We're all owed," he rasped. "We just don't know when the bill comes due." Troy sat down in the chair beside him, rubbed his hands together. "I signed a petition this morning," he said. "Pushed it through with the county. New rule for the season. No steel traps, no hunting permits above the valley until spring thaw. Effective immediately." Mabel looked over at him, surprised. Troy didn't meet her eyes. He kept looking at Barrett. "Not much," he added, "but maybe enough." Outside, the sky was turning that soft shade of pearl gray that meant snow was coming again. The kind of snow that buried old footprints but didn't erase what left them. The Bigfoot had returned to the porch. He didn't sit this time. He stood tall, one hand resting against the beam, the other hanging loose at his side. His amber eyes scanned the town's horizon like he was memorizing it. And Mabel knew. He was getting ready, not to vanish, but to leave something behind. The sound of boots on snow echoed faintly, not from anyone walking, just from memory. The kind that plays inside your chest when something sacred is closing its chapter. And in that quiet before twilight, Ennis exhaled. The war was over before it started. Not with force, not with proof, but with a child being caught before she hit the stairs. With a man waking in time to see his past forgiven. With a hand placing grass beneath a statue like a thank you note written in silence. There were still questions, still fear, still people who would talk too loud at the diner about things they didn't understand. But for now, something had shifted, and if you listened close enough, you could hear it. Not in the wind, not in the machines, but in the stillness. The kind that comes only after grace has passed through and left the door open behind it. And though no one spoke it out loud, everyone felt it in their bones. The story wasn't over, just folding into something new. By the time spring reached Ennis, it didn't come all at once. It eased in slow, like a forgotten melody drifting back into the room. Snow still clung to the north faces of the hills, the creeks ran thick with melt, and the wind still knew winter's name. But the light changed. You could feel it, in the way the sun hit the tops of bare cottonwoods, in how the ice cracked just a little louder at noon, in the way birds returned without ceremony. Barrett Lowe stood on the edge of the field, his cane planted in the softening ground. Breath steady, if a little shorter than it used to be. He wore a canvas coat faded from years of sun, collar turned up, a wool scarf tucked neatly under his chin. He hadn't left the town limits since he woke up in that dim-lit room over the clinic. Hadn't gone more than a block for weeks. But something had pulled him out this morning. Something quiet. He crossed the back lot behind the old community hall, followed a narrow trail of matted grass that wound through the pasture behind the church, past the place where rusted barbed wire curled in the weeds like tired punctuation. He walked slow, one foot placed with care. Cane pressed deep to keep him steady. The Virgin Mary still stood at the center of that field. Weathered, pale, her arms outstretched the same way they'd always been. The paint had chipped off her hands, and the base had cracked down one side during the last hard freeze, but she hadn't fallen. Not even during the heaviest storm. Barrett reached her just before the wind picked up. The breeze smelled of thawing mud and sage and something wilder. Something that didn't belong to town or time. At her feet, resting in the fresh grass, was a small pile of dried stalks. Simple, brown, pressed together at the base with a kind of clumsy symmetry. Wild grass, one sprig of yarrow, a cedar needle tucked into the center like a signature, and next to it, lying half buried in the earth like it had waited all winter, was a lighter, silver, scuffed, the kind that came from a roadside store or the back of a ranger's truck. On the side, just barely visible through years of scratches, were two letters carved by a penknife decades ago. B.L. Barrett bent slowly, knees aching, back grumbling like old pine, and picked it up. The metal was cold in his hand, familiar in a way nothing else had been since he came back. He hadn't even realized it was missing. He turned it over once, thumb pressed to the lid, but he didn't flick it open. He just held it, staring down at the two small items that had been left there, as if the ground itself had whispered them back. Behind him, the wind moved through the grass. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He knew. At the edge of the field, half wrapped in the green shimmer of new season, stood the figure. Not hiding, not waiting, just there, still tall, still wide across the shoulders, still covered in that deep dark fur that caught light like wet bark. But the way he stood now, it was different. Less guarded, more open. His face, even from across the field, was visible. That same human-like wild man face that had stayed in Barrett's dreams and Mabel's prayers was looking at him now with something calm in it, something unshaken. The skin beneath the fur showed faint lines that hadn't been there before, the beard growing a little longer where it blended into his neck, and his amber eyes held something gentle. Recognition. Barrett gave the faintest nod. The figure didn't move. Didn't need to, because in that moment, the space between them wasn't distance. It was understanding. A wind passed between them again, softer this time, curling the grass just enough to stir the bundle at Mary's feet. And somewhere in the rustle of it, in the hush of it, Barrett heard it. Not with his ears, not even with his thoughts, but with that part of him that still remembered snow under boot soles, blood on the trap's teeth and hands. Trembling, enormous, frightened, held out not in anger, but in plea. The voice wasn't a voice, just a feeling. You were heard. He didn't cry. He just closed his hand around the lighter and turned back toward the trail. Behind him, the field held its breath, and when he finally looked back one last time, the creature was gone. Not vanished, returned, somewhere deeper, somewhere wilder, and Barrett kept walking. He made it back to the porch just before lunch. Breath a little shorter, smile a little longer. Mabel was sitting on the steps, shelling peas into a tin bowl, the sunlight hitting the silver in her hair like threads of glass. She looked up as he came closer. "Well," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "you were gone long enough to see the season turn." He sat beside her without answering, took the lighter from his pocket and held it out. She saw the letters, saw the scrape across the bottom edge, and her lips parted. "You found it?" He nodded once. "I think he kept it, all this time." Mabel looked out across the street, where the shadows had changed just slightly and the clouds were beginning to thin. "They say there's a name for that. she said. When someone remembers what they owe you longer than you remember giving it. What's the name? She shrugged, smiled without teeth. Grace, maybe. Later that day, Troy came by with a clipboard and a tired look. He didn't ask about the creature. Didn't need to. He just handed Barrett a form. It's official, he said. The winter hunting freeze has been extended. Steel traps outlawed valley-wide. No exceptions. Barrett signed without speaking. Troy paused, then cleared his throat. I also put in a proposal for a conservation zone around Blacktail Hollow. No development, no clear-cutting. Barrett finally looked at him. Why? Troy glanced past him, out toward the meadow. Because some places deserve to be left alone, even if we don't understand why yet. The sun dropped lower that evening, slipping behind the Bitterroot peaks in slow golden layers. The last light caught the top of the Virgin statue, made her glow just enough to make someone passing by stop and think twice. And somewhere out past the tree line, past where maps stopped mattering and paths faded into memory, something moved between the trees. Quiet, slow, still watching, not guarding, not haunting, just remembering. Because sometimes mercy doesn't speak. Sometimes it kneels. And sometimes it just waits long enough for someone to learn how to answer. The field grew silent. The air cooled. But the story didn't end. It just settled into the land. And if you stood there long enough, with your hand on the lighter in your coat pocket and the wind brushing the back of your neck like the breath of something bigger than yourself, you might swear you heard it again. Not a word, not a voice, but something older, something true, saying quietly, you were never alone. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us longest. They aren't loud. They don't come wrapped in thunder or spectacle. They arrive like the hush before snowfall or the warmth of a hand that reaches out when it doesn't have to. Stories like this remind us that grace doesn't always wear a crown, and mercy doesn't need an audience. It just needs a moment, a choice, a heart that's willing to see what others overlook. This was never just a story about wilderness or legend or fear. It was about something far more familiar. Something deeply human. It was about the way kindness can echo across years, about how even the smallest act of compassion can grow roots in another soul and bloom in a season we'll never witness. Sometimes we don't get to know the full measure of the good we do. We just have to trust that when we move from love, quietly, selflessly, it matters. It endures. We live in a world so often divided by noise, by suspicion, by the illusion that we are separate from one another. But if we learn to listen, not just with our ears, but with that deep place inside us where empathy lives, we start to remember that we belong to something bigger. We are bound not only by blood or belief or name, but by the unspoken promises we make in moments of truth. To protect, to forgive, to return kindness when it is least expected and most needed. There is something deeply sacred in being seen without fear, in being known without judgment. And maybe that's what these stories are truly about. Not the mystery of what walks in the woods, but the miracle of what happens when we choose to walk beside it. When we allow wonder to soften our certainty. When we let love lead instead of pride. Because maybe the point was never to explain everything. Maybe the point is to feel it, to carry it with us, like a cedar sprig tucked in a coat pocket, or a memory folded carefully into the silence of our hearts. A reminder that we are never truly alone, not when we choose to see one another, not when we dare to believe in what can't always be proven, but is no less true for its mystery. Thank you for listening, for opening your heart to this story. If it touched you in some way, if it made you pause, or feel a little less alone in this world, I'd be honored if you shared your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to the channel for more stories that speak softly but carry meaning that lasts. We'll be right here, waiting, listening.